But what you may not know is that my middle name is Sadeh. I was born and raised in Yellowknife, and my parents wanted to give me a name that reflected the place in which I was born. They decided to give me a Dogrib name, Sadeh. Dogrib is the language spoken by the Tlicho people. My middle name means ray of sun, which my parents picked to complement my first name, which means tree of life. Anisa is an Arabic name that is commonly used in Persian culture. My parents are both from Tehran, Iran, and immigrated here as young adults. Both sets of my grandparents were also Iranian. My grandfather had a happy and successful life in Iran before the revolution in 1979. Although my parents had already immigrated to Canada at that time, my grandparents lost their civil and economic rights overnight. My grandfather here, Papa, was visiting my mom in Canada when the revolution happened, and he was unable to go back to his country. His businesses, money, and properties were all seized as the theocratic government did not accept his religion, the Baha'i faith, the religious community my family and I are still a part of. To this day, Baha'is still are persecuted in Iran. My name reflects the culture that has made me who I am and has given me the lens through which I see life. I am a Baha'i Persian woman, born and raised in a Canadian city instilled with Indigenous culture.
As you may know, my name is Karen, but what you might not know is that my full name is Gurkiran Kaur Gill. I was born and raised in Surrey, British Columbia. My name reflects the heritage that my parents brought with them from the region of Punjab, India. My parents were both born in rural villages in Punjab, but my mother left at a very young age and was raised in Slough, England, where my grandfather had immigrated in the early 60s. She did not return to India very often, but was raised as an Indian in Britain. My dad, on the other hand, did not leave India until his late 20s and spent a majority of his life in the village. Their marriage was one that was arranged by mutual relatives. My dad often told me stories about the Sikh insurgency in the early 80s and 90s in Punjab and how people like him, turban-wearing Sikhs, were subject to human rights violations at the hands of the police authorities. Being raised in Surrey, it was like I was a part of Little India. Everyone around me looks like me, follows the same religion as me, and the Punjabi culture is so rooted within the community. I was raised in a very traditional environment amongst other first-generation Canadians who also struggled to find their place as Indians in a Canadian city that was so heavily rooted in the culture.
Hey,
Hey!
how's it going?
Okay, I'm kind of tired, but...
Okay, do you want to talk about our project?
Yeah. So for our project, we pretty much decided what we were going to do was pick two separate movies. One that was kind of a Persian movie, and then I picked an Indian movie. Well, I mean, I guess a Punjabi movie that we would each watch and see how our different cultures kind of shaped the way that we viewed the film. Especially since, like, you know, over the time that we've become friends, like, we've kind of realized, like, there's so many things that are, like, different about our cultures, similar about our cultures, and all semester long we were talking about interpreting film, and we just kind of thought, we wonder how our respective experiences and cultures would shape the way that we viewed a different film in addition to the Inuit films we've discussed in class. So that's kind of where our idea comes from.
Yeah, and what we did was we watched both movies on two separate days, and then when we watched the Persian movie, we got Persian food, and when we watched the Indian movie, we had Indian food. So we did that and discussed a little bit there, and we're just gonna put together what we discussed today in this video.
Okay, so we got some Indian food to like enhance our Indian movie watching experience.
Well, mostly for Anisa. I think I've got way too much of that.
Okay,
we're going to continue. Okay, so we're having Persian dessert.
Yummy.
And we're going to watch the Persian movie.
Yeah, and then do you want to show the trailer of your movie?
Yeah, so I'll show
Okay.
you the trailer of the Persian movie, and it's called A Separation. Oh, that's not the right trailer. Okay, here it is.
نه خیلی ایشون نه معتاده نه مشکلی داره، خیلی هم آدم خوب و سالمه.
پس برای چی میخواد الان بگی؟
برای اینکه ایشون نمیخواد با من بیام.
منم کشوندی اینجا پیشنهاد بده. آقای قاضی چیکار کنم؟
ایشون بهونه کرد.
من بهونه نکردم. شما گفتی یه دنه بیار من
اجازه بده من صحبت کنم.
بفرمایید.
من الان تکلیفم چی میشه حاج آقا؟
هیچی. بفهم زر زندگیتون.
چیه؟ بابا خواب بود با در روش قفل کنی بری؟ داشت میمرد من رسیدم. خانم بیا برو.
تو با این زنه امروز دعوا کردی؟ گفت زدیش تو.
من زدمش.
پس چه بردنش بیمارستان؟
یه خانومی آوردن امشب اینجا به اسم راضیه.
بچهش سفت شده. چی کارش کردی مگه؟
شفاف توضیح بده آقا. اتهامش الان قتل.
آقای عزیز
دروغ گفتی؟
مگه تو نگفتی جدی نیست؟
جدی شد.
Okay, so that was that trailer. Karen, do you want to show yours?
Yeah, for sure. So here is my trailer. if you want to talk about the separation first, what you took away from it, and then
Okay, sure. So separation, I saw that there was a lot of the sacred form of law, because as we saw, the caretaker really used her religious beliefs to inform everything she was doing. At some point, she even called someone, I'm not sure who exactly it was, but someone who had the religious knowledge that she needed, and asked like whether or not she could change the grandfather because he's a man. So that was a big part of the film, and even towards the end, she didn't want to lie due to her sacred beliefs and the law from her religion, which was Islam. Also, there was just like customary law, like the fact that she, at some point, the caretaker wasn't sure whether it's okay for her to be alone with the father, like the main character father, not the grandfather, and she was kind of discussing that with the wife, but the wife wasn't like shocked by that or anything. So it just seemed like customary that maybe men and women shouldn't be like alone together unless they're, married or in like a familial relationship. Also social interactions were kind of a source of law, and that was kind of within the language. Like a lot of the language, like just saying goodbye or different words in the film had like religious connotations to them. They like goodbye in Farsi is Khudafis, so it has Khuda is God, and it means God in Farsi. So it all, like many of the words had religious context to them, so it just kind of informed like the culture as a whole is very religiously based. And then also there's positive law in that, like the very beginning, like you could only get a divorce if both parties wanted a divorce. So that was just an example of positive law as well.
I think that I took away like most of what you're saying from it, but I feel like for me, like for someone who wasn't, I don't know, it's like I know we've talked about how like Iran is like an Islamic state, but like India is like Indian culture is so different in that sense because there's so many different religions, and like there's like no like one religion that kind of dictates everything. So I know for me, like a lot of like the way that they were behaving in terms of like when she needed to like call the guy to ask him if he could change the man, if she could change the man, like I was pretty blown by the fact that there's like this religious hotline that you can call to basically confirm if something's okay for you to do or not. And for me, like a lot of that, I guess, again, viewing it from like my perspective, to me seemed a lot like I guess customary law as opposed to sacred law, only because like the only time like you see things like that happening in Indian culture it's rooted in culture, it's not necessarily rooted in religion. Or like the fact that she asked him like, like she was like really uncomfortable about being in the house with the woman's husband without the woman being there, and how she was so alarmed, like, hey, like I would feel a lot better if you were here. And I think that for me, like where like the positive law really came in was like when I looked at like their I guess like at the beginning, like the divorce situation, right? Like when they were trying to figure out like how to get a divorce, what the reason for the divorce was, and like the way that entire situation kind of played out, how they're like sitting in this room. It's not really like a courthouse. There's no formal procedure. They're not with their lawyers. They're like with the guy that's going to make the decision. It was essentially like them sitting with a judge, and the judge is trying to grant a divorce. And then also like towards the end, I don't know if this felt like this way with you, but I felt like when they were trying to negotiate like a money deal, right, to basically get out of like to have the case dropped, kind of seemed like a settlement negotiation a little bit.
Yeah, that's true.
right?
very
So it was,
informally.
yeah, right? So it was like, hey, like, well, we can end this now if we can settle for a certain amount. And then it was interesting how, like, sacred law kind of played into that because she was basically being asked to swear on the Quran, right? That swear on the Quran that you lost your baby because of me,
Yeah.
right? And how that was kind of like, I mean, I took evidence this semester, like, which was like, I'm too traumatized by it, but I took evidence, and in evidence, like, they talk about basically the role of like taking an oath,
Yeah.
and how like that's one of the factors that determines capacity at common law. So to me, it kind of seemed like it was like an oath, but it was like really sacred. It's like people understand like the importance, or like, you know, the significance of doing that. And then even at the end, like when they're finally about to get their divorce and they're sitting there again, and basically they ask the kid, like, who do you want to live with, your mom or your dad?
Yeah.
Right? And like the child, so like how it's just kind of interesting how it was, to me, it seemed like examples of positive law just kind of cloaked with sacred law, and that's how they were depicted. And then obviously just like a lot of the social interactions, like how like they were I guess like mostly like the men and women dynamic of it in terms of social interactions. Like they're not really like like it kind of seemed like they were speaking to each other, but she was very like hesitant about being with him alone all the time, or like basically for customary law, like how she was so worried that her husband was going to find out that she was going to be there.
Yeah.
So I guess like the sources of law in that sense weren't that difficult for me to relate to, because like there were so many things that I knew from like Canadian society and like my own culture that I could pick up on things and be like, oh, okay, I understand what's happening here. I understand what's happening here. But I took a different perspective on it in terms of like, for me, it wasn't like religious based, because I didn't understand the religious aspect of it. Like, for an example, like when she says hello and goodbye,
Yeah.
I think I remember asking you, and I was like the subtitles say like God is with you or something like that. And so to me, like, that was like weird, because I'm like, okay, like because you're Baha'i and they're Muslims, like how are you saying like the same thing with like a religious connotation to it to each other? Like that part for me was like a little bit hard to understand, because in my culture, like we greet each other saying like we say something called sasrikal, right? But like it's only like Sikhs will only say that to each other, but like, and then Hindus will say something else to each other.
Yeah.
So it's like the hellos are very like based off on religion. I mean, they're like kind of like have like a religious underlying to it. You wouldn't say that to someone who is Muslim, for an example. So to me, like that part of it was a little bit confusing.
Yeah, that's interesting. I was just gonna say that something you said reminded me. So I think everything, like the effect of the sacred law was much stronger in this film than any positive law or any other customary law. Like the effect of the sacred law was so what's the word? Just it was very, not only was it prevalent, but it was significant. Like I don't think it mattered as much to break like a positive law as it did to break like a sacred law. Because like, for example, when when the father accused the caretaker of stealing, she was like swearing. She had a very big problem being a thief. Like that was an issue for her, and like she was swearing on like
she sweared on her martyrs. Yeah, I remember.
And
this.
So like, and it was like, I think her identity, and probably, I'm not sure if this is like for everyone in the film, but her identity especially was very tied to her religion, and that is what she followed. I don't think like her leaving the grandfather for a bit, I mean, the way I interpreted it was, I don't think she found that as wrong, because it wasn't something that's like clearly written out as being wrong possibly in her religion. You know what I mean? Okay. So I think there's something about that. But what you were saying about the greetings is, so like Baha'is, we do have our own greeting, but as just in Farsi, the greeting is what like Muslims say. So like it's more like the Iran is like an Islamic state, so everything is, I think, a bit more rooted in Islam.
Yeah, no, I think it's like I guess like now that you say it that way, like oh, like that religion was such a central component of the entire movie. Like again, like I don't see it.
Yeah.
It's just really hard because to me it just seems like customary because I'm like, okay, like that seems really like crazy to me that like someone would be that like I guess like that fundamentalist
Like
in
dogmatic.
like their yeah, like in their thinking and like or just I wonder if like customary law and like sacred law kind of go hand in hand.
Yeah.
And it does kind of make me think about like I guess like some of the movies that we've watched this semester in terms of like Inuit laws and like shamanism and like that kind of stuff. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And like how that those kind of play off each other. So I wonder if they're actually mutually exclusive or just kind of like moving together.
Yeah.
And like influencing each other. I just find it interesting how like so much of what I took away from that was very much so based off on like what I like know.
Yeah, like from what I understand, like because your culture is more deep rooted in tradition and
Yeah.
not as much in religion, so you took it more as being like tradition and customary law. Whereas, yeah, I think that the way I took it, well, and I could also obviously understand the words that weren't being translated properly. I think sometimes in subtitles, but yeah, I really understand like the significance of a religion, and also I just know about how Iran is and how like it's a theocratic government, so it's very religious based. So yeah.
Yeah. And then I guess like for my movie, like I thought that there was a lot of examples of it was weird because there's a lot of examples of positive law, but I would say positive law abuses. Just because like I don't think that it says anywhere that like the police authorities can do this. Like they can just come to your house and like for no reason and search around. I don't think that that's kind of an actual thing, but I think that it's like normalized, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Because no one really questions it. So like at the beginning of the movie, when you at the train station, when you see like the police officers walking around, and then you like towards the end of the movie, like when they barge into the home and they just start searching. So like I felt like there was a lot of significance placed on like the police authorities in the entire movie.
Yeah.
Or like even when they were trying to board the train and the train conductor was like, you can't get on here, right?
Yeah.
And I felt like there was majority of my movie again I think was it was kind of hard for me to understand like what the sources of law in the movie were, just because it was all so rooted in, I guess, like the circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
Like it was so much so shaped by what was going on in the background in terms of like politically and like the fear of people and how people would react. So I guess like on the basis of that you could call it customary law, like how they knew that, you know, it's getting late, so we need to find a place to be because it's not a good idea for us to be out this late.
Yeah.
Right? And walking around, like they knew that. Or like how like another example of customary law was when the grandma lets them basically like recognizes the lady. She says to her, oh, you know, this is your uncle's house, but it's like they're not actually related. It's because they're part of the same village. And like typically in Indian culture, it's like if you're a part of the same village, like you're automatically family.
Yeah.
So she said, so she says that, so she says, hey, like, come, like, you know, like my son will take you to wherever you need to go. And like examples of sacred law, I guess, would be the fact that the entire movie is about like the Sikh insurgency, right? So it's about like religious persecution, and like you hear at the beginning of the movie, you hear the gentleman at the beginning, like he's saying like a Sikh prayer, and also just I guess like people's attire. So you see like the Sikh militants are in like traditional Sikh attire, whereas you see like the general Sikh farmer who isn't a militant, like he's just in like normal like Sikh farmer clothes. So I feel like that's also an example of sacred law. So that's kind of what I took away from it.
Okay, yeah, I really had like kind of a harder time understanding this film. I think there wasn't like a ton of dialogue and it was very contextual. Like as we talked about it, I started understanding a little bit more. I don't think I would have even realized something was going on in the country if there wasn't that beginning scene where they just like kind of laid out what was going on in the like there was a Sikh massacre. So I found law in like kind of like what you said, like positive law because of the authority figures that were always around, and also like I'm not sure if this was positive law or customary law, but like the train needed to go empty, and like so I wasn't sure if that's like just like a law of like in a state of emergency, or maybe it's just like a customary law for what's going on in the country. Also, just like I just noticed like little like there was law in social interactions. For example, when I guess the main character, his wife and his child, were going to the house, and they were asking for them to open the door. Like the man came out first to make sure, I think everything was okay. So I think maybe that's like part of customary law. I mean, it's a little bit. I think it's similar in North America, so maybe that's why I kind of picked that up. And then also, like I think at some point, like the grandmother, or I don't know, I guess she was. I guess they weren't related, like you're saying, but I thought they were related because she was saying like he was saying I'm your son-in-law. She was just saying like women have to go to the wedding a few days early so that they can help with the wedding. So there's just like I guess some like gendered customary law there too. But like as a whole, I wasn't really exactly sure where the law was coming from because I was just pretty confused about what was going on.
Okay.
But yeah, the thing was like I thought that one interesting part is when we were talking about the movie and you were telling me like these are Sikh militants. Like I would not know that, but you said like because of the shape of their turban, like you could tell they were Sikhs, and like that's something I would never really know. So I would just like I'll look it up. I will actually just show you what you showed. Not understand the movie the way you understand it because I just didn't have that context.
Yeah, and like for me, the parts that I did understand was based off on things that I understood relative to myself. Whereas like there was things that I didn't get, and that's because I'm not familiar with that kind of world.
Yeah.
So it was hard for me to relate to that.
Yeah, and even when we were kind of talking about like the Sikh massacre, I mean, it's not the same thing, but Baha'is are persecuted in Iran. So I was just trying to like make connections there where I could, and that's the only way I could kind of make sense of it.
Yeah.
And so I used like my perspective to make any sense of it that I could.
Yeah. So I guess, like now that we've talked about sources of law, I think it's really important for us to understand what our laws as a legal tool we're trying to argue for. And I think it might be a good idea for me to start with mine because mine was such a strong, like it was so rooted in, I guess, politics. I mean, what did you think the argument of my movie was?
Like to be honest, I really couldn't tell. Like I felt pretty confused throughout the entire movie, but I could just like feel a sense of fear. So that's the only thing that really just came across to me, but I don't really know what the argument was.
Yeah, like I feel like for me, I can understand how you feel, just because like even with someone who understands, I guess, like the cultural background and the context of the movie, it was very difficult for me to follow just because it didn't have a lot of dialogue. So I was kind of like, okay, I don't really know what's going on here. But I feel like one thing that I took away from it was, like, I've watched movies on like the Sikh insurgency before, and typically they take a very strong like victim approach. So it's always it's always like antagonizing the government, whereas I felt like this movie kind of didn't do that. Like, it didn't say if something was right or wrong. It just kind of showed it to you and then showed the human experience. So for me, the argument of the movie was to showcase, hey, regardless of what happened on the militant side and the government side, at the end of the day, like, there was real people amidst all of this, and these were their real emotions in reaction to the political climate at the time. And I think it took a very human approach to what was going on. And for me, when I think about things, I think about think about movies that we watched this semester. I think about movies that are related to more the necessities of life, or the grandma movie. Which one was that?
Before Tomorrow.
Before Tomorrow, or Atanarjwa. I felt like I related to those movies better, because for me it was like they didn't come across as Inuit movies. They came across as like human experiences, and that helped me understand things better.
Yeah.
Like, I know that when we were watching my movie, you just kept saying, like, you're like, I don't know what's going on, but I just know that people are scared.
Yeah.
Right? Like, there's a sense of fear in this
with
movie.
the sound, like, in the movie, like, all you could hear is like basically crickets, and it was just like a very empty feeling because of that sound. Like, there's not a lot of dialogue and just crickets. Like, I think that kind of brought like a sense of fear.
Like, just a lot of silence.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then I know that I sent you the clip. Do you have the clip open there?
ਇੱਕ ਹੀ ਸੀਟ ਤੇ ਬੈਠੇ ਹਾਂ ਤੇ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਫੜ ਕੇ ਉਹਨੂੰ ਬਾਂਹ ਜਦੋਂ ਥੱਲੇ ਖੜਿਆ ਮਗਰ ਹੀ ਮੈਂ ਆਈ ਹਾਂ। ਮੈਂ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਆਖਿਆ ਵੀ ਇਹਨੂੰ ਕਿਉਂ ਖੜਿਆ ਇਹ ਬਾਅਦ 'ਚ ਦੱਸਾਂਗੇ। ਤੇ ਬੜਾ ਮੈਂ ਤਰਲੇ ਕੀਤੇ ਕਿ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਇਹਨੂੰ ਛੱਡ ਦਿਓ, ਤੁਸੀਂ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਬਾਅਦ 'ਚ ਦੱਸਣਾ ਹੁਣੇ ਪੁੱਛ ਲਓ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਜੋ ਪੁੱਛਣਾ। ਨਹੀਂ, ਉਹ ਬਦੋ ਬਦੀ ਮੇਰੇ ਕੋਲ ਲੈ ਗਏ ਆ ਤੇ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਜਦੋਂ ਮਾਰਤਾ ਤਾਂ ਅਸੀਂ ਲਾਸ਼ ਵੀ ਮੰਗ ਰਹੇ ਹਾਂ, ਲਾਸ਼ ਨਹੀਂ ਦਿੱਤੀ ਉਹਨਾਂ। ਤੇ ਇਹ ਗੱਲ ਦਾ ਇਨਸਾਫ ਹੋਣਾ ਚਾਹੀਦਾ, ਕਿਉਂ ਇੰਨਾ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਅਤਿਆਚਾਰ ਹੀ ਕੀਤਾ ਇੱਕ ਕਿਸਮ ਦਾ। ਜਾਂ ਤਾਂ ਕੋਈ ਉਹਦਾ ਕਸੂਰ ਹੁੰਦਾ ਤਾਂ ਫਿਰ ਤਾਂ ਅਸੀਂ ਆਂਦੇ ਵੀ ਚਲੋ ਮੁੰਡਿਆਂ ਵਿੱਚ ਸੀ, ਜੇ ਇੱਕ ਦੋ ਵਾਰਦਾਤ ਉਹਨੇ ਕੀਤੀ ਹੁੰਦੀ ਤਾਂ ਮੈਂ ਵੀ ਆਂਦੀ ਚੱਲ ਕੋਈ ਨਹੀਂ, ਮੇਰੇ ਪੁੱਤ ਨੇ ਕੀਤੀ ਆ ਤੇ ਹੋਈ ਹੈ ਹੀ ਕੋਈ ਨਹੀਂ ਵਿੱਚ ਉਹਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ। ਇਹਦਾ ਇਨਸਾਫ ਇੰਨੇ ਚਿਰ ਦਾ ਅਜੇ ਤੱਕ ਨਹੀਂ ਮਿਲਿਆ ਤੇ ਮਿਲਣਾ ਚਾਹੀਦਾ।
So what exactly happened there?
Basically, she, it's essentially like the story, like I told you about, like what would happen at the time. Like, the police would legit just pick up anybody, kill them, and you would never know what happened to them again. And that's why people were so like fearful. And that's kind of like the fear that was depicted in the movie.
Okay.
I don't know if after watching that, it makes you feel more like, I guess, like, what I mean by the argument of the movie is like the human experience.
Yeah, I understand what you mean now.
Yeah.
Okay. Interesting.
Like, what do you think the argument of your movie was?
Okay, so I think that the argument was it was trying to show the kind of sandwich generation of like being a parent and a child. So a child that has to take care of their parents that are getting old, and a parent who has to take care of their child, you know, and do what's best for their child. And I think it just was showing specifically like that generation, but within a context where doing what's best for your child couldn't be done at the same time as doing what's best for your parent, because the mother in the movie like was wanting to get her child out of Iran because the state of Iran isn't great. But he couldn't leave because he has to take care of his father. So I think that it was just showing the struggle of being responsible for two different generations, but not being able to fully help both. So I think that was, and through that it showed kind of like the conditions of Iran, like to have to pick between one or the other, you have to be in like a pretty bad state. So I think it was just, even though it didn't particularly show much about like the politics of Iran and the government, I think just that fact said a lot about how Iran is, and that it, for like the mother, it was worth it for her to move for her child.
And I guess like like I obviously don't understand like the political climate and from that perspective, but for me, like I guess like the argument was, yeah, it was about making choices. And yeah, I think the entire movie was about making choices. So for the guy, it was choosing between his family and his dad, or like for the woman, it was choosing between her husband and being a good Muslim. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, like the caretaker, you mean?
Yeah, sorry, the caretaker. Yeah. So for me, like so much, and then at the end, it was the child having to choose between her mom and her dad.
Yeah.
So like for me, like the movie was like a lot about choice, and I guess like when you say it that way, it makes me think about like just tying it back to like the perspective that we started this project from, and that's basically the struggle that we feel between our legal identities and what we truly identify with. Yeah. So I don't know if you want to take the lead on that first, like how you feel like your legal identity compares with what you feel like you are.
So yeah, my legal identity is like a Canadian. I have no citizenship within Iran, and so although my legal identity is Canadian, I feel like very much in the middle of both. Like I don't necessarily, I very much so identify with my Persian culture, but not fully to the extent of somebody who's like born and raised in Iran. So like I don't understand things the way they understand them, but I also don't understand things in the way like my Canadian counterparts do as well. So I just feel like my legal identity is so different from my personal identity because it doesn't really define it fully. Like even like in school, like I was born and raised in Yellowknife, like I mentioned before, and so I think we were the only Persian family in Yellowknife for most of the time that I was there. So I didn't really have a lot of Persian influence in that way, but because I was so close to my family and my parents are like immigrants, it was a lot. I was brought up that way, but I always had a struggle of kind of understanding what way to see things. Like I wasn't sure. Like they would tell me, my parents told me something's not right or something's not like just like correct to do, and then like all my friends at school would think something completely different. So it was very hard for me to reconcile with.
Okay.
And so I think my identity is kind of a mixture of both, that's not really reflective of just my legal identity.
Yeah, I guess like I relate to that, but in a different way. I mean, growing up in Surrey, like the fact that like I went to high school, like the experience is similar and different for me in like other ways. For me, I went to high school with like I would say like 80% Punjabi Sikhs. right? So we all have like the same type of cultural background. We all have the same values that we're being raised with at home. The same stuff is being reinforced when we go to school. But then like you're coming home and like you're watching TV, or like there's like certain things that we want to be able to do as being like Canadians. And it's kind of hard to reconcile with, because you're stuck. You're like, well, everyone keeps telling me that this isn't right for me to do, but like this is what I want to do. And like the biggest examples I can give you is like things like drinking, for an example. Like women in it's looked down upon in the Punjabi culture if women drink. And it's kind of like, you know, everyone a part of my generation, like in terms of girls, typically does, but then that's something that you can't bring home. Like you're think about it, you're like 25, you're 30 years old, and you can't come home and like, you know, tell your parents, hey, like I enjoy the occasional glass of wine. And like that experience is very like similar for like most people. I mean, things are becoming more progressive as like, you know, the first generation to now there's second generation Canadians. Some people are third generation Canadian, but for me growing up, like that was the experience, and it was common knowledge. Like everybody knew, like, hey, like you need to make sure like her parents don't find out. Or like in terms of dating, like dating is something that isn't something that's really in like it's just weird to like have this group of friends that understands everything that you're going through and is facing the same struggles as you are, and you're just kind of it's kind of the downfall of being raised in a community that's so rooted in the culture, because you have two separate perspectives. It's great. I get to celebrate my culture. I walk out of the door, there's people that look like me. I, you know, go to the grocery store, and like I see people who like interact in my language and stuff like that. And, you know, that part's all nice and well, but then there's also the other side of it where I'm trying to be a Canadian, and there's like things that there's kind of obstacles that are set up for me, like being able to freely make the choice to be the type of person I am, especially if it means to not move out of Surrey, if that makes sense. And I think that like I think it's got its good sides and its bad sides, but I know that I strongly feel like still living in Surrey, and now I'm just thinking I just accepted a job in Surrey. Like why did I do this to myself? But it's just kind of consistently being stuck in that on that crossroads to be like, well, like Canadians think this is good, but Indians think this is bad. I am Canadian, but apparently I'm also Indian. So like what's right and what's wrong, and trying to find the balance in between those two things.
Yeah, so I think like there's just like I have like a very similar experience, but not being surrounded by people of my culture mostly. But I think so our thing, or how we feel is in general, tell me if I'm wrong, is just that we have two different cultures that we kind of can't always reconcile with, and then also we kind of are we have like a middle ground where we're not really either. So we have like a different perspective of kind of like a mix. And that even like informs like when we're watching these films, like I wouldn't be understanding it the same way that somebody who's like born and raised in Iran would, and you probably wouldn't understand it in the way that somebody who's born and raised in India would. So like we're bringing this different perspective of understanding it in this way that's maybe like well, however like the directors try to kind of portray, we might not be understanding it fully that way. Or maybe we are, but it's just kind of like we're kind of like in this gray area.
One way, yeah. So like last names, I know that like it's just something like we've kind of grown up with. Like I think that as much as people want to say like the caste system isn't a thing in India anymore, or like the government tries to regulate against it, I still think like it's a thing in India. Like it totally is. Like my dad could tell you like what caste somebody is just by their last name. So it's kind of, I don't know. It's weird.
And that's like, so parents, like maybe not all parents, but like it's something like they consider if their kid wants to marry somebody from like another caste.
Yeah, I think that like even though that we've immigrated to Canada and inevitably like become Canadians, I think that that's kind of the part where the whole multiculturalism thing like breaks, because you never stop, like you bring the good and bad from your country then, right? So something like the caste system, you know, we all know like it's not a good thing. You're basically putting people into certain categories based off on like what their families did historically, and by that logic basically saying like you're beneath me, you're higher than me, but you kind of bring all those things with you. So I think that obviously, like me being first generation Canadian, and you know, don't get me wrong, I have friends that still think that's a big deal, right? And we've grown up in Canada, went to Canadian schools, grown up in a Western education, and the fact that they still hold on to those values, like I don't know if it'll be different like with my kids or you know, or after that, but I still think that it's still something that's very much so like a thought that's in people's heads, which is really weird. And I think that you never stop. I feel like you like, I think that's what that whole notion of multiculturalism and identifying as an Indo-Canadian entails. It's like the good and the bad, which is, I don't know how I feel about it. Like, I think it's great that I get to hold on. I think it's great that I get to identify myself as something that I've inherited, and then something that's my own by default of being Canadian. But I think that then it becomes up to me what I want to take away from each thing. Like, for example, I've had cousins that have asked me a question where when I started dating my boyfriend, asked me like, oh, what caste is he? Yeah. And it's just like funny to me. I'm like, well, I went on one date with a guy. I didn't think to ask on the first date, like, hey, by the way, like, what's your caste, right? And the fact that that's a thing, and that's a legitimate question, apparently, right? Yeah. So I find that interesting, like, because I don't think I would ask somebody that question, but not everybody's the same.
Plus, like, some people, like, it might be more ingrained into them, like, because whatever their parents taught them, like, every household's different, right?
Yeah, and like, in my house, this is really funny that we're talking about this, because I went to a religious private school up until grade 7, right? And I grew up in Surrey.
Like what kind of Sikh?
Yeah, Sikh, right? So, and I grew up in Surrey, where, like, almost everyone's, like, Sikh or some form of, like, Northern Indian. So, like, we all have, like, the same values and whatever. And, so it's, like, funny to me, like, how much in, like, especially when you're in an environment like that, like, how much you're shaped by things that you learn at home. So, like, sometimes I would go to school and, like, obviously every religion has, like, its fundamentalist aspects, and, you know, being, like, a first grader coming home, like, telling my parents, like, hey, if I don't get baptized, like, my teacher said this is going to happen. But then by virtue of having, like, parents that weren't, like, ignorant to the fact that there's other things out there in the world and wanting me to make my own decisions, were able to tell me, like, hey, wait a second, like, no, that's not how it works. And then also having the courage to, like, then go to school and basically get in my teacher's face to be like, what the hell are you teaching a first grader, right? Like, you can't, like I want my child to have the values and yeah, and also, but at the same time, like, I understand that, like, this is our religion and these are our values as, like, that we bring back from India, like, wanting me to have that and wanting me to have, like, the language piece and all those things, but at the same time, like, no, also having, like, I guess the mindset that we don't want our kids to inherit these bad things, but then at the same time also picking and choosing what's bad and what's not, and then dictating that to me in that sense. So I don't know, like, it's kind of interesting how that works.
But I think it also ties into, I guess, one thing that we've talked about in the course and just in general is, like, this challenge of seeing from the other side and from the viewpoint of the other.
Yeah.
And being able to relate to their experiences strictly from their standpoint as opposed to relative to us, because I think that that's what you tend to do. You view everything relative to yourself as opposed to viewing it headstrong from that person's perspective, because that's so hard to do when you're not a like you're not a party to it. Like, you know what I mean? Like, this didn't happen to me. How am I supposed to know what this is supposed to be like?
Yeah, I think that is a huge challenge, and part of that, I would say, that challenge is kind of shown through just like the language barrier. When we were watching the films, I didn't understand obviously anything that was being said, but also just like when for your film, but when I was watching like a Separation, I noticed that there was like certain words and certain sentences that weren't being translated. Not they weren't being translated properly because there might not be a translation, but they weren't getting exactly the point across. Like I said before, many of the words were very religious and just had like just different, just like had a bit of a different context. Like even just like terms of endearment were kind of just a little bit differently said that gives a different feeling. So I think just like the language barrier makes it such a challenge to put yourself in somebody else's shoes, let alone like just the whole context and background.
Yeah, and I think that like again, I think that it's something that we've kind of touched on in the course, but also I think just as law students and I guess being prospective lawyers in a TRC world, and I guess just stressing the importance of, I think that what it boils down to is, at least for me, like my interpretation of the TRC is like, you are never going to understand the struggle. Like, you're never going to understand it because it didn't happen to you. You're never going to be able to feel that like in a true and authentic way unless it's relative to your own experience. And I think that that's okay, but it's just the fact that I think taking the steps necessary to educate yourself so that you're able to be sensitive and informed about what you're dealing with.
Yeah.
I don't know, like what's your perspective on that?
I think obviously it's okay because there is no real other way, for one. I think it's just, yes, educating yourself, and also just realizing that culture in and of itself is something that is extremely significant and should be just like anything to do with it needs to be done with such care. So anything that has to do with another person's perspective has to be taken with much care because it's mostly rooted into their culture and experiences. So that's where I'm at with that.
Yeah. It basically tells you what's truth and authentic, right? Yeah. So if the film chooses to take on a certain perspective and reveals that to me in a convincing way, then that's the meaning that I'm going to take away from it. So for me, I guess, again, like my movie was about the political climate in Punjab at the time. And, you know, the fact I felt like I felt very like I felt a struggle like while watching my movie because it didn't take a side. Yeah. Right? So it wasn't telling me what the meaning in law was. It was just telling me how people felt, and it wouldn't tell me like this is right and this is wrong, as opposed to other movies that I've watched about the Sikh insurgency that like definitely take a side and tell you, hey, what the police authorities did was completely wrong. But you don't see that in this movie. So for me, it's like the relationship between the truth, the meaning, and justice in law is totally shaped by the way the filmmaker decides to tell the film. And I guess I would go back to like the example of Flaherty and how he talked about like the power of observation and the power of revealing, and how the first time he had the power to observe but not the power to reveal. Yeah. And you know, maybe that's why he staged it, because he wanted to reveal what he thought, right? So, or what he thought it should be. So for I feel like the filmmaker has so much power in that sense as a utilizer of like a film as a tool to like reveal things about law, to choose what the filmmaker wants to say is the truth or not the truth.
Yeah, I would agree, and I'd also add to that like the filmmaker has a lot of power in kind of just deciding which audience the film is targeted towards. So our films are foreign films, right? So I think more so the audience is the people of that country or that speak that native language, which are usually generally born and raised in that country, who have that kind of level of understanding of the context. So I think that having that target, like if this movie was made in English, but it was like a Persian movie, it would have like a completely different meaning to the viewer and reveal a different truth. But because of the like kind of target audiences the directors choose, that also just shapes the meaning, because it's showing things that are only hinted at but have so much context behind it that only that target audience would understand. So I think that also just reveals the truth and justice.